appendicular skeleton. The appendicular skeleton comprises of pectoral girdle and the pelvic girdle. The forelimbs articulate with the pectoral girdle, while the hind limb articulates with the pelvic girdle. Girdles also provide surface area for muscle attachment. Play the animation to view the appendicular skeleton. The pectoral girdle. The pectoral girdle is the part of the skeleton of a vertebrate animal that provides the attachment point support for the forelimbs. It is made up of two halves, each of which consists of three bones, namely the scapula, the coracoid process, and clavicle. Play the animation to view the position of pectoral girdle in human skeleton. The scapula is a flat triangular-shaped bone which overlies a number of ribs on the anterior side. At the tip of the scapula is a depression called the glenoid cavity, which articulates with the head of the humerus to form a ball and socket joint. The joint formed allows movement in all the directions. The scapula has a projection known as the spine, which runs parallel to it. The spine provides a surface for muscle attachment. Close to the glenoid cavity are two projections, the acromion and metacromion. Both are used for muscle attachment. The clavicle articulates on one end with acromion process and the other with sternum. It is for muscle attachment and aids in the movement of the arms. Play the animation below to see the various parts of a scapula. Forelimb. The forelimb is made up of the humerus, ulna, and radius, and the bones of the hand. The illustration shows the humerus, ulna, and radius and the bones of the hand. Humerus. Humerus is the single bone of the upper arm. It consists of a long shaft whose upper end has a rounded smooth projection known as the head. There are two projections near the head. The uppermost is known as the greater tuberosity, while the lower one is the lesser tuberosity. Between the two tuberosities is a groove that the tendons of the biceps muscles pass. At the lower end is the trochlea, which articulates with the forearm to form hinge joint at the elbow. The illustration shows the humerus. The head of the humerus articulates with the glenoid cavity to form the ball and socket joint. Play the animation to see the articulation of the head of the humerus with the glenoid cavity. Ulna and radius. Ulna and radius are two bones found in the forearm. The radius is found on the side of the thumb, while the ulna is on the side of the small finger. The photograph shows ulna and radius. The ulna is longer than the radius and has a depression known as sigmoid notch found at the upper end. The sigmoid notch articulates with the humerus. A projection known as the olecranon process extends beyond the sigmoid notch. This process provides surface area for muscle attachment as well as preventing overstretching of the forearm when straightened. The illustration shows various parts of ulna and radius. Bones of the hand. The distal end of the ulna and radius articulates with small bones of the wrist known as the carpals. The carpals articulate with the 5 longer bones known as the metacarpals, which form the palm. Metacarpals on the anterior side articulate with the phalanges, which are the bones of the fingers. The thumb has 2 phalanges, while the fingers have 3 phalanges each. The illustration shows carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. The pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle is made up of 2 halves which are fused at the pubic symphysis. Each half is made up of 3 fused bones, that is, Ilium, Ischium, and Pubis. The photograph shows pelvic girdle of a human. The 3 bones are collectively known as the innominate bone. Each half has a depression known as acetabulum, which articulates with the head of femur to form a ball and socket joint. Play the animation to see how the head of femur articulates with the acetabulum. The ilium is above the acetabulum and provides a large surface area to which thigh muscles are attached. Between the ischium and pubis is a hole called obturator foramen through which blood vessels, nerves, and muscles pass. The pubic symphysis is composed of flexible cartilage which permits widening of the female's girdles. The illustration shows the obturator foramen in pelvic girdle. The hind limb bones. The hind limb consists of the femur, tibia, and fibula, and bones of the foot. The illustration shows femur, tibia, and fibula, and bones of the foot. Femur. Femur is a long bone found between the hip and the knee. It is the longest and the strongest bone in the body. The head of the femur fits into the acetabulum, forming the hip joint. Below the head of femur is a projection known as the lesser trochanter. On the upper side is the greater trochanter. Both trochanters provide surface area for muscle attachment. The diastole end of the femur has 2 curved protrusions known as condyles with patellar groove. The condyles articulate with tibia to form a hinge joint at the knee. They also articulate with the patella. The structure of femur is shown on the illustration below. Tibia and fibula. The lower part of the leg consists of 2 bones known as tibia and fibula. Tibia is larger than fibula and has condyles at its proximal end for articulation with femur. The fibula is attached to the distal part of the tibia. The illustration below shows tibia and fibula. Bones of the lower foot. The bones of the lower foot are the tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges. The tarsals are the bones of the ankle and articulate with tibia and fibula at the proximal end, and metatarsals at the distal end. Metatarsals are longer and articulate with the phalanges on the lower side. The bones of the lower foot support the weight of the body. They also act as a lever when one is walking. The illustration shows tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges. Joints. A joint is the location at which 2 or more bones make contact. Joints can be classified into 3 categories, namely immovable joints or sutures, partially movable joints, and freely movable joints. Immovable joints. These are joints that are characterized by presence of tissues between the joining bones that tightly hold the bones together in position to allow very little movement or no movement. Examples of immovable joints. Joints between cranial bones. The photograph shows the joints between cranial bones. Joints between pelvic girdle bones. The photograph shows the joints between pelvic girdle bones. Partially movable joints. These are joints characterized by cartilaginous pads between the joining bones. There are of 2 types, gliding and pivotal. Gliding joints. For example, joints between vertebrae bones, carpals, and tarsals. Play the animation to see movement in the gliding joints of the vertebral column. Pivotal joints. This is a joint in which a bone rotates around another, permitting only rotating movement. For example, joint between atlas and axis vertebrae bones. Play the animation to see movement in a pivot joint. Freely movable joints. These are called synovial joints. They are characterized by the presence of a cartilage covering the surface of the articulating bones. They have a synovial fluid secreted by the synovial membrane separating the articulating bones. The joints allow a wide degree of movement of the articulating bones. The articulating bones are connected to each other by ligament. Movable joints are of two types: ball and socket and hinge joint. The illustration shows a synovial joint. Ball and socket joint. This is a type of joint with two bones, with one with round head and the other one with a depression or cavity into which the head of the first bone fits and moves freely. In ball and socket joints, movement is possible in all directions, that is, 360 degrees. However, the joint bears little weight. The photograph shows a ball and socket joint. Examples of ball and socket joint are joint between head of femur bone and acetabulum cavity of ilium bone. The photograph shows a hip joint. Joint between head of humerus bone and glenoid cavity of scapular bone. The photograph shows a shoulder joint. The animation shows the head of humerus moving into a socket and subsequently rotating at 360 degrees. Hinge joint. This joint allows the movement only in one direction. The smooth condyles of one bone fit in the depression of another and articulates to allow movement in one plane of backward and forward at 180 degrees. Examples: elbow joint. Joint between distal end of humerus bones and proximal end of ulna at the sigmoid notch. This can be called the elbow joint. The photograph shows the elbow joint. The animation shows movement of the hinge joint through 180 degrees. Joint between the distal end of the femur bone and the proximal end of the tibia and fibula bones. This can also be called the knee joint. The photograph shows the knee joint. Joint between phalanges, metatarsals, and carpals. The illustration shows a joint between carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. Muscles. Muscles are tissues made up of cells that are specialized for contraction.